Hello, welcome to the Matt Pfeiffer Experience. My name is Matthew Pfeiffer. I am your host, and today we're going to be talking about 5 ways to overcoming social anxiety. We're going to be taking a listener email, and if you have an email that you want me to answer, make sure you send it to justaskmatt@mattpfeiffercoaching.com. Again, that is justaskmatt@mattpfeiffercoaching.com. With all that being said, let's get started with today's show.
Dream big, Papa told me dream big, 'cause all we take with us is the things we did. Dream big, yeah. Just dream big, yeah. That's what my papa said. Dream big, mama told me dream big.
Welcome back to the Matt Pfeiffer Experience. And so today we're going to be talking about 5 ways to overcoming social anxiety. And so let's get into today's email, and then let's get into the tips on how to overcome. So this email reads, "Hi, Matt. I had a traumatic experience a year ago with a narcissist and have been working very hard on recovering and working on myself, but I struggle with anxiety and depression, and I'm able to control it, but I feel very alone most of the time. This is very common, especially when you're coming out of a toxic relationship. Oftentimes, when you're coming out of a toxic relationship, you start struggling with bouts of depression, but also it's not just depression. Oftentimes, it's symptoms of PTSD and or CPTSD. If you go through my videos, I talk a lot about CPTSD and PTSD and triggers. And if you go down to the description, I actually have a full course on triggers. And one of the triggers, overcoming triggers, is talking about, a lot of it is talking about symptoms of CPTSD. So let's get further into this email. So this email continues to read, "My question to you is, how can I work on my social anxiety and depression to start to have healthy relationships with family, friends? I'm not dating yet in my life. Thank you very much." So when we're talking about dealing with social anxiety, one of the things I love about your email is that you're being very intentional. We have to understand that we are all, every single one of us, are wired to connect. And when you leave a narcissistic relationship, one of the very first things that you want to do, that it's very common, at one point in time I struggled with this too, we want to isolate. We think that isolation is the way that we are going to protect ourselves, to stay away from people, to stay away from friends, to stay away from family members. And in a lot of situations, to stop dating it altogether. And I understand that sometimes you might need some alone time. It's very important to reconnect with ourselves. And you might want to take a break from people. You might want to take a break from the dating scene. But we also have to understand that we are wired to connect. I cannot stress that enough. And so when we get to a point where we are completely isolating ourselves, it has the potential to make that depression and to make the symptoms of the CPTSD and the anxiety and those sorts of things worse. Because, again, we are wired to connect. That was, I want to say, a 75 or 100-year research done by Harvard, that we are wired to connect, that we are better off in relationships, not necessarily romantic, but in all sorts of relationships, and connecting with friends and connecting with family. So I like the fact that you are being very intentional. If you find yourself in that situation where you're isolating, rather than just taking a break and taking time for yourself and that sort of thing, but when you are just home alone by yourself all the time, don't want to connect, and every time someone asks for you to hang out with them, you're finding reasons and excuses not to go out, not to hang out, and you're finding yourself more often than not alone, then it might be something that you might need to reevaluate. So number one way that we begin to deal with our social anxiety, so then we can be intentional and reconnect with people, or stay connected with people, and start to actually address some of these social anxiety symptoms and the CPTSD symptoms, is number one is that we need to be very mindful. So one of the things that I want to point out with this email is that this person said that they had previously dealt with a narcissist. And some people who struggle with social anxiety, it may not be a narcissist, may have been a toxic person, someone who has violated you in terms of being very condescending, being very hypercritical towards you, that sort of thing. Someone who was very bullying, very mean towards you, and that sort of thing. And these things can cause a lot of social anxiety, especially if you are embarrassed, especially if you're embarrassed in public, and it goes on and on. And so this can create a situation where you want to where you want to isolate, like we talked about before, in a situation where you think that this is going to protect you. But when we begin to practice mindfulness, what happens is that we begin to stay in the present, right? That's what mindfulness is, or a large part of mindfulness is staying present. That even though we can acknowledge and we can honor the fact that these things actually really did happen to us, right? So we're not diminishing our experience, but we're also staying present, especially if you are with friends and family, if you're with and around people who are healthy, which is another thing that we really need to do, is that we make sure that we're surrounding ourselves with good, healthy people that are supportive. And when we're present, we can begin to honor and respect the fact that the things that have happened to us in the past are not happening to us right here, right now. Right here, right now, we're very safe. Right here, right now, we're around people who are respecting and honoring our boundaries. Right here, right now, we are very safe. And what happens is that that oftentimes when we've had bad traumatic experiences the way that you have, what happens is that we can oftentimes get into our own head, and we can begin to criticize ourselves the way that the previous person or the people in our past may have criticized us. And so what happens is that all of a sudden these thoughts start to plague, that we think that everyone around us is judging us, that everyone around us is criticizing us, everyone around us thinks that we're done. But when we begin to practice mindfulness, what happens is that we can say to ourselves, and we can acknowledge that, you know what, that may have been what was true in the past, but that's not what's happening here right now. So number one and number two kind of go hand in hand. So number two is to learn how to relax, because oftentimes when we get into our head in these social anxiety situations, our nervous system can begin to go on high alert. And oftentimes, and for a lot of people, this can lead to panic attacks, can lead to a lot of heavy breathing, lead to sweating, that sort of thing. And so we want to learn how to relax. And so when I say relax, I don't just mean like just tell yourself to relax. Learn how to breathe. One of the things I teach people who I work with is box breathing. Breathe in for the count of 4. Some people, some therapists, some coaches teach the count of 8. It's not so much about the count as much as it is about the actual breathing. People who struggle with anxiety tend to be shallow breathers. They have very short breaths, and there's nothing wrong with that on the surface as long as you're breathing, right? But at the same time, we have to understand that to alleviate anxiety, think of the anxiety being deep in your lungs, and we have to push that out. So we want to inhale for the count of 4, hold it for the count of 4, exhale for the count of 4, and then stay exhaled for the count of 4 or 8 or whatever your count is. And you continuously do that until you notice that your nervous system, and until you start to realize, until you start to feel relaxed. You can do this literally in any place, any situation, any social setting. While you're at a party, I've had people I've worked with in the past that they've done this in court to help alleviate that social anxiety. Number 3 is to work out. For some people, that might be yoga. For some people, that might be going to the gym. But we have to understand that when we take care of our physical body, that helps alleviate a lot of anxiety. Number 1, just like I talked about in way number 2, is that you're breathing deep whenever you're working out. But we also have to understand that with anxiety, oftentimes there's a physical component that comes along with that. And the better off and the better that we take care of our physical body, then what happens is that this also takes care of a lot of your social anxiety as well. For some people, doing something like yoga, something like Pilates, going swimming, going for a walk, oftentimes helps with anxiety. One of the things I tell people is to be proactive in situations like this, is to take care of yourself before we go out into social situations. The other thing is that it helps with your confidence as well. And so if you are feeling more physically fit, the less that you're going to get into your head about people possibly judging you about the way you look, how you fit in your clothes, and that sort of thing. For me personally, yoga doesn't work because number one, I'm just not that flexible. But for some people, for me, going for a run, doing sprints, forces me to breathe deep, just like we were talking about in sign number 2 or in way number 2. And this helps me deal with my anxiety with being out social and that sort of thing. The fourth way that we can deal with our social anxiety is to choose to live life. And that sounds strange on the surface, but one of the things I tell people is that oftentimes, especially in a situation like this, when you're coming out of a traumatic experience and or a traumatic or toxic relationship, is that oftentimes people think that we have to heal first, then we get to go live life. And it's actually quite the opposite. We have to choose to live life first. What do I want my life to look like? And this is something that you can actually do when you are by yourself and kind of in your own head and things like that. What do I want my life to look like? You mentioned in your email that you're not dating yet, and that's okay. But when you are ready, what do you want your dating life to look like? For some people, it might be traveling. Where do I want to go? Do I want to travel? Do I want to eventually buy a house? Do I want to eventually buy a new car? Choose to live life first. And here's the reason why. When you start thinking about what you want from life and how you want to live your life and that sort of thing, what happens is that you're going to start to think about some of the barriers between you and the life that you want to live. Those barriers now become your goals. So, for example, if you want to begin to date again and you say to yourself, but I don't know anyone, I don't even know where to start. Well, guess what? Now we need to at least acknowledge the fact that we need to get out, that we need to be more social, that we need to introduce ourselves to people, that sort of thing. And what happens is that when we begin to set goals for ourselves, now we have measurable steps on over, and that's going to also help us overcome that social anxiety. The next way that we are going to deal with social anxiety is to actually be creative, whether that's creating videos the way that I do, whether that is doing some sort of art. For a lot of people I've worked with, one of the things that I've talked to people about is doing adult coloring books. And the reason why this is that, and the reason why this helps out with social anxiety is that oftentimes we struggle with needing and wanting to be perfect all the time. This thought process of wanting or needing to be perfect to be accepted by people comes from a low self-esteem, and it didn't just come out of nowhere. This came from the people in your past making you feel like your imperfections were problematic and that you weren't accepted because of your imperfections and that sort of thing. And so what happens is that when we begin to perform some sort of creative activity, whether it be in the form of art, whether it be in the form of videos or photography or whatever the case is, one of the things that happens is that you yourself are going to notice that there's an imperfection in whatever art that you did, whether it be an adult coloring book or whatever art that you're doing. And what happens is that this actually forces you to accept those imperfections. And especially if you decide to put that on display, I think a lot of people go to those studios where they do like the wine, the sip and paint and things like that, or the tea and paint, wine and paint, or whatever the case is. And what happens is that you start to notice and you start to see that everyone has a different perspective of the way that art should look. And everyone also typically has an appreciation for everyone's art. So what happens is that it forces you to accept the imperfections in the art that you're putting on display. And so what happens is that this has the potential to lead to you being more accepting of your imperfections. And the last way that this is just kind of a bonus that we can begin to deal with and overcome your social anxiety is to get involved in groups, begin to read, begin to watch videos like this and connect with other people who have or are struggling with social anxiety. The reason why is that oftentimes we think that we're the only ones. This is something that's very, very common, is that no matter what your struggle is, we think that we're the only one. And one of the things I tell people that I work with is that you're not the only person who has this struggle. You're not the only person who needs to overcome this. And when you overcome this, you're not going to be the first person who has overcame it. And I don't mean that to downplay it in any way, shape, or form. But what happens is that when you start to realize that there's other people who are struggling the same way that you are, you start to realize that you're not alone. You start to realize that especially if you talk to people or if you read about people who have some success stories, you start to realize that there's ways that you can overcome this. You can basically duplicate and reverse engineer some of the things that they've done. And it also helps you become more accepting, especially if you meet people and if you talk to people who have successfully accomplished this similar accomplishments. So with all that being said, thank you very much for writing in. For those of you who have a question that want me to address it here on the Matt Pfeiffer Experience, make sure you send it in to justaskmatt@mattpfeiffercoaching.com. Again, that is justaskmatt@mattpfeiffercoaching.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you comment down below and let me know some tips that you think that you're going to implement that you feel like are going to help you out. Make sure you're also sharing this out to other people. If you're listening to this on Apple or on Spotify, make sure you guys I would love for a review. Let me know something that's helped you out. Every once in a while, I take time out to read the reviews here on the Matt Pfeiffer Experience. With all that being said, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.
Dream big, Papa told me dream big, 'cause all we take with us is the things we did. Dream big.